A quiet old veteran walks into a training hall only to be publicly humiliated by a young instructor quoting regulations at him. What no one knows is that the manual in the instructor's hand was written by the very man he just tried to dismiss. This is a story about pride, silence, sacrifice, and the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this mean something to you, take a second to subscribe, because some heroes don't wear their medals where you can see them. I don't care how long you've been around. If you can't follow regulation, you don't belong in this room. The words didn't just land, they cut. Every head in the training hall turned, not out of curiosity, but out of that quiet, uncomfortable instinct people have when they sense something isn't right, but aren't sure if they should intervene. The old man stood still, not stiff, not defensive, just still. His posture wasn't weak, but it carried weight, the kind that comes from years, not hours. His shoulders were slightly bent, not from age alone, but from things carried far longer than most in that room could understand. His name was Arthur Hale, and in that moment, to everyone else, he looked like just another outdated relic, someone who had overstayed his relevance. The instructor, Daniel Cross, stood tall at the front. Crisp uniform. Perfect posture. The kind of confidence that comes from memorization rather than experience. In his hand, he held the manual, a thick official document, and he tapped it sharply. Section 4.3, he continued, voice firm, almost rehearsed. Protocol compliance is mandatory. No exceptions, no improvisation. You either follow it or you step aside. Arthur didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't even blink, but something in the room shifted, because silence, real silence, is never empty, and his was full. Arthur Hale had once been the kind of man whose presence alone could steady chaos. Decades earlier, in places where maps felt like suggestions and survival came down to instinct, Arthur had led teams through environments where the air itself felt hostile. The desert heat had once wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket, each breath tasting like dust and metal. He remembered the smell of burned machinery, the sharp sting of smoke cutting into his lungs, the distant echo of voices calling names that would never be answered again. He had carried men, not metaphorically, physically, but crossed terrain that didn't forgive weakness. He had made decisions where hesitation meant death, and certainty came at a cost that never truly left him. There was one night he never forgot. A broken convoy, communication lost, darkness thick enough to swallow sound. One of his men, just a kid, really, had looked at him with fear that tried to hide behind training. "Sir, what if we're too late?" Arthur had looked back, steady as ever, even though inside, the answer wasn't something anyone wanted to hear. "Then we make sure someone else isn't." That was the kind of man he had been, the kind who didn't just follow rules. He understood why they existed, and more importantly, when they needed to bend. Years later, after service had taken more from him than it had given back, Arthur had been asked to help write something new, a manual, a system, guidelines that would shape how future generations operated under pressure. He hadn't written it from theory, he had written it from memory, from scars, from names etched in silence. Every line had a reason, every clause had a story, but nowhere in that manual did it say, "Forget the human in front of you." "Are you refusing to comply?" Daniel asked, his tone tightening. Arthur finally lifted his gaze, not aggressively, not challengingly, just directly. There was something unsettling about it, not because it was harsh, but because it wasn't. It was calm. Too calm. "I'm observing," Arthur said quietly. A few people shifted in their seats. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. Daniel frowned. "This isn't a place for observation. It's a place for adherence." Arthur nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the statement, not agreeing with it. "And yet," he replied, "you're observing me right now." A ripple moved through the room, subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't a debate. Arthur didn't respond, and somehow, that felt louder than anything he could have said. The training exercise had been simple. Simulated emergency, limited resources, time-sensitive decision-making, the kind of scenario designed to test instinct under pressure. Arthur had stepped in, not to take over, but to adjust something small, a positioning choice, a timing shift, tiny details. But in real situations, tiny details are the difference between recovery and loss. Daniel had stopped him immediately. Protocol violation. And now here they were, a room full of trainees, watching a man being corrected, or so it seemed. What they didn't see was the difference between knowledge and understanding. Daniel knew the manual. Arthur knew why it existed. Minutes passed. No one spoke. The air felt heavier, not because of conflict, but because of restraint. Arthur didn't defend himself, didn't explain, didn't reveal anything about who he was, because men like him didn't need recognition to validate their truth. But something else was happening. In the back of the room, a woman, Lieutenant Mara Vance, watched closely. She hadn't spoken yet, but her eyes had narrowed, not in judgment, but in recognition. There was something familiar about the way Arthur held himself, not physically, but internally. The kind of stillness that only comes from having already faced things far worse than public criticism. She glanced at the manual in Daniel's hand, then back at Arthur, and slowly something began to click. "Let me make this clear," Daniel said, louder now. "No one is above protocol, not experience, not age, not opinion." Arthur nodded once, and then, for the first time, he stepped forward, not aggressively, just deliberately. Each step carried quiet certainty. When he spoke again, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Protocol exists," he said, "to guide decisions, not replace them." Daniel immediately shook his head. "That's not what it says." Arthur's eyes flicked briefly to the manual, then back to Daniel. "You're right," he said. A pause, and then, "It doesn't say that." Confusion flickered across a few faces. Daniel seized the moment. "Exactly. Which means," Arthur continued, gently interrupting, not with force, but with presence. "It doesn't say a lot of things." The room went still, because now, this wasn't correction. This was something else. Mara leaned forward slightly. Her heartbeat picked up, not from tension, but from realization. She had seen that tone before, years ago, in a briefing room, a guest consultant, a man who spoke very little, but when he did, people listened. Not because they had to, but because something in his words felt earned. She looked at Arthur again, really looked this time, and suddenly the pieces aligned. Arthur turned slightly, addressing not just Daniel, but the room. "Rules are written," he said, "after mistakes have already been paid for." No one moved. No one interrupted. "Every line in that book," he continued softly, "exists because someone didn't make it back." A silence fell that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was heavy, respectful, real. Daniel tried to respond, but something in his expression faltered, because for the first time, he wasn't speaking from certainty. He was reacting, and Arthur was remembering. Arthur's gaze returned to the manual, and then almost absently, he said, "There's a paragraph in section 4, second revision." Daniel froze. "That wasn't supposed to make it in," Arthur added. A chill moved through the room, because that wasn't something you guessed. That was something you knew. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Arthur understood the manual. It was, how deeply was he connected to it? Daniel Cross didn't speak, not immediately, because something had just slipped, something small, almost invisible, but undeniable. "There's a paragraph in section 4, second revision. That wasn't supposed to make it in. That wasn't knowledge you found in training. That wasn't something you memorized. That was something you lived through." The room held its breath. Daniel's grip tightened slightly around the manual. His thumb pressed into the edge of the page as if grounding himself in something solid, something familiar, because suddenly the manual didn't feel like authority anymore. It felt like a question. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice no longer sharp, just controlled. Arthur didn't rush to answer. He let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of how truth often arrives, slowly, deliberately, without urgency. He stepped closer, not confrontationally, but with quiet intention. "You're quoting it like it's absolute," Arthur said, "like it was written in a vacuum." Daniel frowned, though the confidence behind it had begun to thin. "It's official doctrine," he replied. "Approved, reviewed, implemented. That's not opinion, that's structure." Arthur nodded. "Yes," he said, "it is." A pause. Then, "But you're holding it like it's perfect." The words didn't accuse, they revealed. And something in the room shifted again. Arthur reached out, not to take the manual, but to gesture toward it. "There's a line in there," he said, "about maintaining positional integrity under resource strain." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the specificity. "Yes," he said cautiously. "Section 4.3. Arthur gave a faint nod, and right below it, he continued. "There used to be another sentence." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Used to be?" Arthur's eyes softened, not with weakness, but with memory. "It was removed," he said. "Final review phase." Mara's pulse quickened in the back of the room, because now she was certain she had heard this before. Not the words, but the cadence, the weight behind them. Daniel shook his head slightly. If it was removed, then it wasn't relevant. Arthur looked at him fully now, and for the first time, there was something almost like sadness in his expression. Or, he said quietly, it made people uncomfortable. That landed harder than anything else so far, because it wasn't about rules anymore. It was about truth. Daniel hesitated. Then, almost defensively, he flipped through the manual, scanning quickly, as if he might find something he'd missed. "You're saying there was an addition that got cut?" he asked. Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spoke as if he were somewhere else entirely. "There was a team," he said, voice distant now. "Cold environment, limited visibility, communication unstable." Cold environment, limited visibility, communication unstable. The room faded around him, not physically, but emotionally. Because now, everyone could feel it. This wasn't theory. This was memory. "One of the operators broke formation," Arthur continued. "Went against positioning protocol." Daniel opened his mouth, ready to respond. "Violation," he said automatically. Arthur nodded. "Yes," he agreed. "That's what the report said." A pause. Then, "He saved 3 lives." Silence. Heavy. Complete. Daniel didn't move. Because now, the manual in his hands felt incomplete. Arthur's voice steadied again. "That sentence," he said, "was meant to remind people that protocol is a foundation, not a cage." Mara closed her eyes briefly. She remembered now. A briefing. Years ago. A discussion about whether to include that exact principle. Some had argued it would introduce ambiguity. Others said it would preserve humanity. In the end, it was removed. Too complex, too open to interpretation, too human. Arthur exhaled slowly. "They took it out," he said, "because they were afraid people would misuse it." Daniel looked down at the manual, and for the first time, he didn't see certainty. He saw absence. "Who are you?" someone whispered from the side of the room. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be, because everyone was already asking it. Arthur didn't answer, not directly. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket. Slowly. No dramatic movement. Just intention. He pulled something small, worn folded at the edges, and he placed it gently on the table in front of Daniel. A document, old, not printed like the manual, typed, annotated, hand-marked in places. Daniel stared at it, then slowly picked it up. His eyes scanned the page, and then they stopped, because at the top was a name. Not printed in bold, not highlighted, just there, quietly, but unmistakably. Arthur Hale, author, primary draft contributor. The air changed, not metaphorically, physically. You could feel it, because suddenly, everything Daniel had said, every correction, every assertion, every moment of authority, collapsed under one simple truth. Daniel's throat tightened. He looked up at Arthur. Really looked this time. And what he saw wasn't an outdated man. It wasn't someone behind the times. It was someone who had built the very foundation he had been standing on, and didn't need to say it, because it was already there. Daniel started, but the words didn't come. "Because, what do you say? When you realize you've been correcting the source." Arthur didn't rescue him, didn't fill the silence, because some realizations need space to land. Arthur finally spoke, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. "You don't honor a system," he said, "by memorizing it." Daniel's hands lowered slowly. "You honor it by understanding what it cost to build." No one moved, because that wasn't instruction. That was truth. Mara stood. The sound of her chair was the only interruption in an otherwise still room. She stepped forward, calm, composed, and stopped beside Arthur.
"I was there," she said. Daniel looked at her. confused.
For the review. She gestured slightly toward the document in his hands. That draft was real. Her eyes moved to Arthur. And so was the argument. Nate, to keep that sentence, Daniel swallowed. Because now, this wasn't one man's claim. It was corroborated, confirmed. Unshakable authority didn't transfer loudly. It didn't announce itself. It simply settled, like gravity. Suddenly, no one was looking at Daniel for direction. They were looking at Arthur, not because he demanded it, but because it was earned, and everyone could feel the difference. Arthur turned slightly, addressing the room once more. His voice carried something deeper now, not emotion alone, but clarity. Experience doesn't shout, he said. It waits, until it's needed. A pause. Then, rules will guide your hands, but judgment will decide who makes it home. And finally, the day you stop seeing people and start seeing procedures is the day you become dangerous. Each line landed, not like instruction, but like something remembered, something understood. Daniel straightened slowly, not defensively, not rigidly, but with humility that hadn't been there before. I didn't know, he said. Arthur nodded. I know, he replied, and there was no accusation in it, just truth. Daniel looked at the manual again, then closed it, gently, as if it were no longer just a tool, but something heavier. I was trying to do it right, he added quietly. Arthur's expression softened. You were, he said. A pause. But right isn't always written. Something changed in the room, not just in Daniel, in everyone. One by one, chairs shifted. People stood, not out of command, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Respect. Not loud, not forced, just real. Mara stood first, then another, until the entire room was on its feet. No applause, no noise, just silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than anything else. Arthur didn't react dramatically, didn't acknowledge I to outwardly, because he didn't need recognition. But for a brief moment, his eyes closed, and in that stillness, there were names, faces, memories, people who never got to stand in rooms like this again. And somehow, this moment belonged to them too. Arthur picked up the old draft from the table, folded it carefully, placed it back into his pocket, and turned to leave. No grand exit, no final speech, just a man walking away from something he had already given more to than anyone there could measure. Daniel stepped aside, instinctively, not told to, not instructed, just understanding. As Arthur passed him, he paused for half a second. Not long, just enough. You'll do fine, Arthur said quietly. And then he kept walking. Some people carry authority in their voice. Others carry it in their silence. Arthur Hale never needed to remind anyone who he was, because the truth doesn't demand attention. It reveals itself when the moment is right, and maybe that's the lesson. Not every expert will announce themselves. Not every hero will wear their story where you can see it, but that doesn't make them any less real or any less worthy of respect. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from. And more importantly, tell me what you think. Should rules always be followed, or should they be understood first? And if you believe in stories that honor quiet strength, subscribe, because sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that never needed to speak at all.